the DAWbench Radio Show, the official podcast of DAWbench.com.
Welcome to the DAWbench Radio Show. I'm your host, Curigliano of AAVIM Technology in Melbourne, Australia. Today, co-hosting the show with me is a close friend and colleague, Erin McKimm, who is a professional composer, producer, sound designer, engineer, working in film and television, as well as being a recording and performing artist. Welcome, Erin.
Hi, Ben. How you going? Good morning.
Yeah, I'm great, man. I'm great. 5 a.m. and a cold winter morning in Melbourne, but yeah, we're doing fine. Now, today, we also have a very special guest, and that is Justin Frankel, who is the founder and key developer of Reaper, which is one of the most respected and highly used DAWs in the world. Welcome, Justin.
Thank you for having me.
You're most welcome. I'm taking a guess that the weather situation in New York would be fairly different to what we're experiencing in Melbourne here at the moment.
I'm sure if you do the right math on the temperatures, you could make them similar on different scales. Maybe not. No.
Yeah, so I guess you're in a pair of shorts at the moment, shorts and t-shirt.
That's pretty close, yes.
Awesome. We're far away from that, let me tell you. I think to start the show, it would be good if we give the listeners a bit of history on how you initially got into some programming, pre-Reaper and leading up to Reaper, and then we can discuss, the development of Reaper and the ongoing development of Reaper. So I think that'll be a good place to start.
Yeah. Well, I grew up programming starting, as a kid in the 80s when the computer I had at home was an Atari 800 XL. Mm-hmm. And so I got to see my older brothers programming it and, typed in basic listings from magazines in order to do interesting things. And it sort of stuck from there. And then by the time I got to high school, it was started programming in Turbo Pascal and Turbo C on 386s, DOS, running DOS. And then from that, I went to college, studied a little bit of computer science, spent most of my time that was computer related programming other things, kind of had some drama relating to an entire long story of technically breaking rules at school and, like using computers for purposes they're not supposed to be used for. And then ended up being like, I'm kind of done here and leaving after about a year and going home and started programming other things. And a friend of mine had made an MP3 player for the Mac. And so I saw that and was very much inspired to make one for Windows. So that was Winamp, and that was like my first real Windows, maybe my second or third Windows application, but the first one that was something that you would actually use as opposed to just experiments and demos and things like that. And so Winamp was it was the first Windows application I'd made, but it wasn't the first software I'd made for other people to use. It was just the first for Windows. Before that, in high school, I had made a few different pieces of software that I actually got to have the experience of developing and getting other students to use. And one of them was a mail program, which we had a Novell network at that point. This was we didn't have internet access, but I made some software that we could use to send email to other students when they logged into the student network. So not over the internet, just local kind of utility.
Oh, just in the intranet.
Right, right.
Oh, yeah, I call it intranet, but yeah.
I don't know if people ever use that anymore, but yeah. But at that point, it was a local network. But anyway, so yeah. So I guess just, I always found it very enjoyable making things and getting feedback from users and sort of expanding the scope of software as you go. And so that was how I got my start.
Right. And what year roughly was Winamp developed? Do you remember?
It was like 1997, I think.
97 was version 1, yep.
Something like that, yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm trying to remember when I discovered it. It would have been, it probably was around that time. And I used Winamp, and I've still got it on the machine, but I used Winamp as my default MP3 player for over 15 years. Fantastic app. But, I mean, you left the building at version 2?
Oh, yeah. So in 1999, I sold the company that made Winamp to America Online, which, in case you're not familiar with it, is now a subsidiary of Verizon, I think.
Right.
But no, which, obviously was the biggest, one of the biggest service providers in the U.S. And they were like expanding into all sorts of other businesses. They made tons of acquisitions because their market value was just insane for a few years.
Mm-hmm.
So I sold to them and worked for them until like 2004, I think it was. So I stayed there for 5 years.
Right. So you sold the company and then they gave you a gig for 5 years.
Yeah.
But were you still working on Winamp at the time for that 5 years, or?
Yeah, on and off. There were a lot of other people involved with it.
And that was version 3? Or I'm just trying to get a timeline here. Or no, it was version 3 way later.
There was version 3, and then there was version 5, which was... Version 3 was an experiment in one direction, and then we basically, there's the whole... In software development, there's always the question of, when do you ever want to rewrite everything? And the answer to that is pretty much never. Occasionally you want to rewrite little bits, but you never really want to start over on anything. To do so is pretty much a mistake anytime. Even if the original version of the thing you made is terrible, like there's just no reason to start over, assuming that it's usable and functional.
Is that what happened at 3 or 5?
That's what version 3 was, and so
complete rewrite. Okay.
And then, so version 3, complete rewrite. Then the things of value from it that were most interesting and most usable, we sort of merged back into the version 2, and that's why it's like 3 plus 2 is version 5, and that was the rationale for that.
Right. I get it. Okay. Because I was about to say you skipped 4. So
yeah. Well. The classic joke on that, which is that, Winamp supports skins and no one wants to see Winamp 4 skins. So,
Right. Well, look, that's 4 skins. That's like, why isn't there a Windows 9? That's a whole other conversation. Well, look, the whole thing with skinning is an interesting aspect of Winamp that carried over to Reaper, which I've always found quite unique in regards to DAWs. I mean, there's one other DAW that offered a few different skins. I think the Motu Digital Performer did. Not that I've really spent much time in Digital Performer, but I remember they did a few skins, but nothing anywhere that, like is user configurable or anything like that you've allowed within Reaper.
Yeah. I mean, with Winamp, it was because people were hacking the binary to change the images out, and so it was the obvious thing to do.
So they're already doing it.
They're doing it. You should embrace it and make it more interesting. And so doing the same thing in Reaper made a lot of sense from the get-go.
Of course. Now, before we leave Reaper, I do have one question. You've probably been asked a million times, and you're probably going to hate the question, but the one thing that intrigued me every time I fired up Winamp is you were wanting to kick a llama's ass. Now, I could never work out. I'm going, are they saying they want to kick a llama's what? And so...
Well, your instincts are right. That has been asked a million times, and it's stupid.
Sorry.
And it's whip a llama's ass.
Oh, whip. Oh, sorry, whip.
and it's also not even my thing. It's originally from Wesley Willis, who was a musician from Chicago who would say all sorts of things. including
Whip was on it.
I forget. I think he said something like, I went and saw this show. He basically did these like songs that were about his experiences, and so he'd like, I went and saw this show. It really whipped the llama's ass,
Right?
Something like that. But I can't like, I didn't even, that was, I think, something that other people were responsible for. That was probably Tom Pepper, and I was just I was a teenager. I didn't know anything. I still don't know anything. But he gave me an Easter egg to put in that if you typed in Nullsoft into the Winamp main window, then the title bar would change and it would say it really whips the llama's ass instead of Winamp in the title bar.
Right.
And so then it started as an Easter egg, and then eventually it's like, I think we just Tom had his friend JJ McKay, who's like the radio voice, record the actual MP3 file of it.
Yeah,
So,
the voice from God, almost.
yeah.
The big boomer. Now, I think what we should move on to is your involvement in DAWbench. Now, I have to go back and have a look at when we first started communicating, and it goes back to 2008, Justin. So that is 11 years that we have been communicating and collaborating on this DAWbench project, which is, that's pretty amazing. I had an idea it was around 10 years. I didn't realize it was quite 11. But the initial collaboration was that I reached out to you and needed a plugin that we could scale at an empirical level. And that's where the RXC was just perfect, because you gave us unlimited bands. So that for me was something that I could say, okay, I can start off with 4 bands and I can go to 8 bands, and that would just incrementally increase the overhead. And so I started off at 8, now we've gone to 16, and I'm just about to complete one with 32 per plugin. And that's simply because of the level of scaling that we're experiencing at the moment with the CPU technologies taking off again. So that was the initial thing. But look, I remember in those early days, even just chatting to you about some, quirks that I was seeing when, for example, when the session was looping back, and there was, 45 stereo tracks of audio. There's hundreds of plugins, and so it was needing to loop back, and there was that slight glitch on loop back. And one of the things that really struck me is that I remember emailing you, and I think within an hour you'd emailed back and with the fix, and I went, what? Because at the time I'm used to dealing with fill in blank here, any of the other support personnel of DAW companies, and you'd send them a support or a bug, an issue with the program, and they'd say first thing would be dismissal, and then they'd go into denial, and then they'd start carrying on about, well, no, it's not a bug, it's actually working as designed, it's a feature. So there was this complete different paradigm with the way that you are actually approaching and responding to issues with the program. So to me, that was quite unique.
Well, I should say that we don't always respond to everybody immediately.
Well, yeah, of course.
but there is a pattern to it, which is that if you send us an email that is well thought through and articulates the issue that you're having and gives you steps to reproduce it, and there are varying qualities of bug reports, and when we get bug reports that are really helpful and you read it and you're like, oh, well, let me just look at this. And the right bug report is something that just saves you an unbelievable amount of time. And so when you send people good bug reports, if you get them to the right person, there's no they'll be happy to respond to it like instantly the moment they manage to reproduce the issue. And then, that on the other end of the spectrum, there are people who say, oh, I keep getting crashes since I got the new version. Help. It's like, well, I'm not sure, what's the new version for one? And, what kind of, is it a crash or is it it's need so much more information. And those are the ones that are, it's like, you're going to spend just an hour going back and forth trying to get a decent amount of useful information to find out that it's an issue with a plugin or something else. And so, I think that to people who have bad experiences dealing with people who make software, I think, working on the ability to report detailed information of what the issue is would be really helpful. Having said that, I'm sure there are people who just never read their email anyway, and so it's a matter of getting the right person on the other end of the email. But
yeah. Look, I think I think this is more a company culture thing as well, because one of the companies I had most difficulty with actually getting any type of acknowledgement are a German company, and I had I formulated a saying where I'm saying the German approach to software engineering, which is the first thing they're going to do is they're going to dismiss it, and then they're going to go into denial, and then they're going to get their little bevy of beta testers and whatever else who are floating around the forum to shout you down. But they have actually acknowledged it, and then they are working on it. I
think it's just a matter of getting the right people, because I know plenty of German software developers who may or may not be the same companies you're thinking of. But if you email the right person, the right information, like they totally are like, oh yeah, thank you.
Look, there was always people that would not fit into the mold exactly, but they still had to work within that cultural structure of the company.
Right. I mean, the other factor is that we are sort of a smaller company, and there's just not that many of us working. So, like, I end up reading support email directly at times. So there will be email that come in, and I'll look at it, and so then it'll immediately get addressed or get reviewed. Or Ollie, who reads most of the support email, will point things my way when it seems to be something that's helpful and detailed. Whereas if you have a big company and you have, we are a small, despite your earlier statement about one of the most widely used DAWs, I think we're still very small in terms of some of the other bigger ones. So the amount of traffic we get from email from people is a lot less than they probably do. So it is more manageable for us to look at everything with a more critical eye.
Yep. And look, and of course it is the I suppose the size of the programming team and how many eyes and ears are on it, and whether the left hand is knowing what the right hand is doing. So how many coders are actually involved with the Reaper code apart from yourself?
At the moment, it is the people programming the Reaper itself. It's myself and one other who is Schwa.
Yeah. Well, there you go. And there's the answer, Justin, because, again, you can fill in blank. Doesn't matter whether it's Cubase, Pro Tools, Personas, Studio One. They would have a team that would be massive team. And, it's probably compartmentalized. You work on this area, you work on this area, you work on this area, and then they kind of stitch it together at the end in some respect. And then depending on where the bug is, then you're dealing with that compartmentalized, so to speak, area of the program, which then could break something else. And this is the thing that we were finding, where they'd fix one bug and then create another 2 or 3, and then that would take a whole period of time to get acknowledged. So that was the frustration for me with those larger companies, and still are. I mean, I can report major performance issues where they'll just say, "Oh, thank you very much for bringing that to our attention. We'll give it directly to the coders and the QA," and then you don't hear anything for 3 years.
Well, look, one great thing about Reaper is the amount of updates, which, since I've switched over to Reaper, it's just amazed me how many updates there are and how much is updated and how many new things are included and bug fixes just constantly compared to anything else I've ever used, which is fantastic, I reckon.
I think that's part of why we're able to address issues more quickly and also try to stay on top of it. Is that, the Reaper has plenty of bugs and will always have bugs and new things. As you described with other DAWs, things get fixed, other things get broken. And that's sort of the nature of software, just because it ends up being so complex. The things that we aim for are both to try to limit the severity of the bugs, so that when things, most of the bugs that you see are just things that don't work right, or and in that category there are two, which is things that don't work right when you're making a particular edit, and then there's also things that don't work right where if you load a project that you previously saved, is it going to play the same? So the least severe is things that don't work right as you're trying to make an edit or something like that. And then, up the chain is projects don't play the same as they used to. And then above that is, can you make Reaper crash by doing something? And those are obviously the ones you really want to avoid, especially if you're recording or anything like that. So there's that. But the thing we do to address this, or to try to manage all of this, is, other than our design decisions, is by making, trying to make updates often, so that people can be testing new things and changes early and often, so that we catch them before they go into a release. We release releases to the main website typically about once a month.
Yeah, which is amazing. Comparatively, look, in the earlier days when I had my DAWbench forum running, I've actually just put it in a hiatus at the moment, but I probably will resurrect it at some point. But, we used to have a little bit of an ongoing joke where we'd put up the update cadence of the software. And so we'd say, Cubase one update, and we'd put a date, and then right next to it or below it, we'd have the Reaper updates, and that's kind of running off the page before the second Steinberg update come up. And that's not singling out Cubase, that's pretty much any of the others. And, you could, again, fill in the blank. The regularity of the updates was something that was always very significant.
But that once a month is something that it would be very difficult to do if that was the only releases that we did, because that is actually, on one hand, it's often, but on the other hand, it's actually really slow. So that anytime we change something, if we had to wait on an average of 2 weeks for users to be testing it, it would be excruciatingly slow. So as a result, we have development builds that we provide to any user who wants to use it. It's not private. It's not. There's no exclusivity to it. It's purely, you can opt in to download these versions, and then we update those typically every couple of days.
Yeah, so they're essentially public betas. So instead of having a closed off beta group where everyone is pretty much in a little circle patting each other on the back instead of actually fixing the bugs, and this is my experience with several beta lists, where you report a bug, and instead of everyone working together to actually resolve the bug, you get people pushing back at you saying, well, that's not happening here, so it's not a bug type of approach to the testing. So I think having a open development platform open to the public is just, that's why you have such a
we rely on our users for testing, and they do a better job, I think, than they would if the environment for testing betas was different, for sure.
Yeah, but also as a user, you have that choice. You're not kind of throwing in things too early on to people that are dealing with mission critical work. They have an option, if there's a particular function. I remember the ARA function you put in with Melodyne, and that was something you could go and get one of the beta builds and check out, but you didn't have to. And I think that's really good as well, because you've got that option as a user, depending on where you're at with your work.
Yeah, and I do that myself as well. Like when I'm in the studio recording things, I usually use our master branch, which corresponds to the very, very safe stuff that's in releases.
Yep.
Versus if I'm at home hacking on things, then I'll use one of the newer branches that has a bunch of new features and things like that.
But also how you can have portable installs as well, so you can have multiple versions of Reaper, installed on the same computer easily and jump around between them. And
then also updating is easy because it's a small download that installs quickly, and and the people have the inclination to go and expand all sorts of functionality and add more virtual instruments and things like that, but it's it keeps things simple, just keeping it small and focused, and that makes it work well for us, I think.
Definitely.
Yeah. Yeah. So the ongoing development with Reaper, we've pretty much kind of covered a lot of that. I mean, it's more end user driven by the sound of it, and will continue to be.
I mean, yes and no. It started as my own tool for recording that I wanted to use, and so it has expanded to meet the needs of a lot of other users as well. But it's some combination of that. It's we obviously enjoy taking feedback and improving it according to what people are asking for. But at the same time, it has to make sense within the overall design and the consistency. And for me, at least, Schwa does things a little differently in terms of his value judgment. But for me, it's like I weigh the different factors of how much I will use the particular feature, how much work it'll be, how big of an impact it'll be having to maintain that code in the future, all these different factors. Because there are things that I wouldn't use that would be a ton of work that people really want, but would just require all kinds of work. And so I'm like, I'm not going to do that, which isn't to say it'll never happen, but I got other things I'd rather be doing, or, I might just would rather be testing / recording music for fun. So it's definitely user driven, but it's more like half user driven, I guess.
Yeah, well, of course.
But also the ability for people to create their own scripts. So how I've experienced Reaper, like coming from closed environments like Cubase or Ableton, the fact is that I can just Google something that I want to be able to do in Reaper, and I reckon every single time I found some script that someone's written that I've been able to import, and I've been able to implement it. So it's kind of like
there are some amazing scripters and plugin developers for sure.
Yeah,
like MPL, his scripts are like blow me away sometimes.
I think it's that's just a really powerful part of it, that it's kind of open in that sense. So if you need something, you can generally find it, or you can put something together. You can combine scripts or actions to a macro or something like that. And so, pretty much anything that I've needed to do, because I do numerous different things. I write music, but also do sound design. I kind of can create different versions of Reaper with various functions for those specific tasks. And I've found, like even Reticulate for using articulations with orchestral templates. That's quite amazing what that does. Comparing that to say expression maps or something like that, and that's something that was put together, I think, by a guy called Tack. It's his username. So things like that are amazing, I reckon.
Right on.
Yeah.
I haven't used it, but
yeah, well, you should check it out.
Out of my scope. Yeah,
it's incredible. It's it's a great kind of user interface and a very visual way of dealing with multiple articulations with big orchestral templates where you might have 10 or more articulations per instrument, and it's kind of, you can just create a I think it's like a XML document, and you can basically build your own maps. So you can just customize it, and it works really well. So that's just one example of like something that is just being made by people like users.
Yeah, and that's just an area that is not available in any other DAW. Not that I'm aware of. I mean, they'll respond to some end user feedback and put in features based on end user feedback and requests, but nothing to that extent. And because as you mentioned, Erin, they're all closed. And look, I can understand why they are.
Are they though? I mean, I remember Vegas had like some JavaScript scripting in it and things like that.
Oh, right. Yeah.
I don't really use other DAWs, but I imagine that maybe they have some level of different scriptability in places.
Well, Ableton has Max for Live. That's its own area, which is amazing in itself. Yeah.
Cakewalk had some areas that you could, dive down and script and change the behavior of the audio engine to a certain degree as well. But in the end, you'd probably do more damage than good playing around with that too much. So,
and in fairness, the way Reaper's scriptability works is, it started out that there was this internal API that we would use for writing our own plugins to do different things, and then eventually, that expanded for writing Reaper extensions, and then we made scripting, I think originally with Python, and then with Lua and Eel, scripting that could use those APIs. The problem is those APIs never had like a really coherent design to them. So there's just a bunch of random things to do different tasks. And they mostly work, but it's not really pretty. But had we spent a lot of time designing a really elegant, pretty API, we probably wouldn't have finished it ever, and we'd still be doing that. And so at least we have something that's there and works, but is not necessarily enjoyable to use. So it's a compromise.
Yeah. Well, look, there is a complexity to using Reaper, but Erin can actually chime in on this one. Once you get your head around it, from all of the people that I know that have made the move to Reaper from other DAWs, once they get their head around it and get a workflow, they're not going back. But
that's also a selection bias, right? Where those are the people who succeeded. There's probably some people who are like, no, screw this, I'm going back to Cubase. Or
well, look, and I'll be the first to admit that I'm a Cubase user going back to the early.
I've been trying to convince you to go to Reaper.
Yes, and I've been playing with Reaper for, I've just figured out, 11 years. But I've been a Cubase user since the early 90s, so I'm very heavily entrenched in that whole dynamic of how I'm producing, especially MIDI. So the MIDI side of Reaper, admittedly, is something that I need to get my ass into gear and learn a little bit better, because it's like a crutch. Cubase is a crutch for me when it comes to doing anything to do with the MIDI side of things, because I just know it so well. And it's automatic for me. So the Reaper side, the MIDI side, is more difficult for me. But I am going to force myself to get my head around it and to get a lot better with it, because I'm having to build a new DAWbench VI session, which is probably going to be approaching 8,000 notes of polyphony. And so I'm going to be forced to learn my way around it. The previous Reaper VI session was actually built by another person, a friend in Europe. So I think he's in Scotland, and he assembled it for me, because I just couldn't I couldn't connect the dots with it. Well, no, I couldn't connect the dots quickly enough. So he did that for me. So I'll be forcing myself to get way better with the MIDI side of things. But
8,000 notes, is that like black MIDI? Is that what that's called?
They're sustained notes. What this is the empirical. This is
sounds amazing.
Yeah, this is the empirical benchmark test that it started off with. Let me count this. There was 4 instances total of contact. Each instance had 16 instruments, and 3 of those were the polyphony instances, each with 16 instruments, and each instance fully loaded with 320 notes. So the first DAWbench VI session, and I've got to go back, it might be back to about 2011, 2012, was 960 notes of additional polyphony, and that was covering the CPU technologies of the time. And then I doubled that to 1920, probably around 2013, 2014, and then this last year we've moved it to 3,200 notes and exhausted that very quickly, and I've got one floating around just over 5,000, and that's been exhausted as well. So I'm just going to go all out and do a 6,400 note and an 8,000 note. So that's just given us a very clear indication of the amount of processing power that has scaled over the last 10 years or so since we've been doing this. It's quite amazing. And we just keep laughing about it. Myself and Pete Kane from Scan Audio, who's my test partner, he does all of the CPU testing of late. And he's going, Vin, we need a bigger boat. I'm going, it's okay, I'll just keep building it. And I'll keep building it. And we'll eventually have something that might last us more than a couple of years. I just, I can't even fathom where we're going to be heading. But there are some limitations, and this is something that we can.
Do you worry about the fact that it'll make your benchmarking obsolete because it'll be like, well, does it matter if
No, it's not.
I mean, because who's going to have 8,000 notes of polyphony?
Yeah. It's all about latency, though.
Yeah, no, it's all about the polyphony at respective working latencies, Justin. And so I think the benchmark is actually, instead of being less significant, it's becoming more significant because everyone is now getting all very hyped up about, well, how much CPU power do I have? And I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be the polyphony is the metric, as in the number of plugins is the metric, just so that we can very accurately measure and scale the improvements from CPU architecture to CPU architecture and how it scales compared to clock versus core and total number of cores. And so it's even, the benchmark's not going away, it's actually getting more significant because now as the CPUs are now heading to 28 cores and 56 threads, and this leads into the next question, the line of questioning that I'm going to be asking you is the Reaper engine and the max number of cores, and how do we actually manage those increasing number of cores? Now, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but from my understanding, the maximum number of logical cores that the DAWs can thread to is 32. Now, I know that that's imposed on Cubase, Ableton. I'm not sure on Pro Tools. And I'm not quite sure on Cakewalk, but 32 seems to be a limit where we can see that they're threading nicely. It's a multitasking across those 32 threads. Anything above that starts going a bit squirrely. So, and sometimes very squirrely. Is there anything you can input on that, Justin?
I'm not aware of any real specific limit. I mean, it's just I think that there's a certain amount of overhead when you're just trying to synchronize a bunch of threads to finish or to start at a particular time, and just the amount of diminishing returns that you get. But I don't see any real reason why 32 should be some significant number.
So you don't have a ceiling for the number of cores you could throw at Reaper?
No, I mean there's some compiled in limits just to keep things sort of sane. And I think we probably increased them somewhat recently. I don't remember exactly, but no, I mean, I think the main thing is just there's a certain amount of overhead in synchronizing threads, and then the more you have, the more the overhead starts going up against your the benefits of spreading things out. And there's also the question of how parallelizable a particular project is, and when you have dependencies and routing and things like that, then it starts preventing things from being parallelized properly. So I mean, if you really want to think about scaling and real world projects, a lot of times it might actually be faster to use separate, even if you're using convolution reverbs, it might actually be faster to put separate reverbs on each track than to send common tracks to a convolution reverb. Just because if you put them on separate tracks, then suddenly these tracks can be completely processed independently, and there's no need to have them finish before you run the reverb. So in theory, I think people may need to change their practices in terms of certain routing and the dependency chain of signals. That's something that may end up changing. The other thing that people I think should be aware of is that hyperthreading, while it's a lot better than the original version on the original P4s that had it, for audio does still have some negative effects. And the main thing is the initial problems that it had with scheduling of threads, I think, have been solved. But the main thing is that if you are running hyperthreading and you're using all of your cores, basically your cores are suddenly 75% as fast as they would otherwise be. If you're running 75% CPU utilization, it might give you less than ideal performance having it enabled.
That is interesting. I haven't actually experienced that, but that is very, very interesting. And look, the DAWs themselves, they don't know, they can't tell the difference between a logical core and a physical core. They just say there's there's a core, and bang, I'm going to, assign that track.
Ultimately, it's scheduled by the OS, and
Yes,
the
of
OS makes everything transparent. And if you're closer to 100%, then hyperthreading actually probably will give you an advantage. But if you're at a lower utilization where the real-time threads are running at high use because you have things record armed, then you can have basically CPU cycles that those real-time threads could be using are being used by a lower priority thread that's doing like media decoding or something like that, which then ends up slowing down the real-time thread and could cause less than ideal performance. This is something that came up actually when we when we were doing the Linux port. And with Linux, the nice thing about it is that everything's open, so you can really dig in and inspect how everything is being scheduled by the kernel, and you have just a ton of control over how everything works and total transparency. So it's a nice place to be testing things.
Oh, look, I'd love to use Linux for more than what I do. I mean, I've got a little laptop that I use basically for just my browsing and internet stuff when I'm walking around the house and not in the office, and that's always been running Linux. So I'm very familiar with the OSs and the various builds of it, and I like it. It is just very efficient, very, very simple. I can do anything that I need to on it, but I haven't dabbled in the audio side of it. And that's probably pretty much, if there's something that would be equivalent to the ASIO performance, I'd probably be more tempted. And then I suppose then we've got the plugins. There just isn't the developer support for it, unfortunately. And it's the
plugins I think are the real issue. The audio interface side of things that actually is not a problem.
Right. Okay.
It is fantastic actually if you have good supported hardware. But
what's the low latency driver on Linux, Justin? Is that the jack, or is that, or am I
mainly it's something called ALSA, which is ALSA, and that's the Advanced Linux Sound Architecture. And
right.
So most hardware has drivers for that. And so if like my recording machine in my studio has a PCI RME HDSB card, and so that has an ALSA driver which works really well. And then you can run jack on top of that, which actually has very little, like it runs with similar performance. It makes very little difference as far as performance, but then it allows you to do more things such as routing between applications or to multiple devices.
Okay, so but ALSA is the equivalent to ASIO, so to speak.
Roughly, yeah. There are other modes too. I think there's for some of the FireWire interfaces, there's another API that's used, I think, that Jack supports, but I don't think Reaper does natively. But for the most part, if you support ALSA and Jack, like that's pretty much everybody.
Right. So look, I might have to have another look at it. I mean, is there, what's the Thunderbolt support like on Linux?
I couldn't tell you.
Right. Okay. That's something that I can have a bit of a dabble with. So look, just getting back to the max cores, because that was very, very interesting. I do remember having a conversation with Pete from Scan regards the issues that he was running into with all of the DAWs, but even with Reaper itself, when he was testing one of those higher core AMD chips. I think they were 28 cores, so we're talking 56 threads, and essentially every DAW just fell over itself. Once it got over a specific core count, it just wasn't managing in them at all. So you're saying there's no ceiling in Reaper?
I mean, what latency? What block size and
he would have been testing across all of them. So he would have started at 32 and moved up. But I think at any block size, these things were literally tripping over themselves. And look, I've even found it that the 18-core Intels, so once we got 36 threads, you weren't getting that that perceived improvement going up another 4 logical cores, so to speak. It wasn't scaling in proportion. So as a rule, I tap my client systems at 16 at the moment. I'm saying anything above 16, save your money, put the money towards RAM or something else.
Higher clock speed too, obviously.
Yep. But simply because I know that 32 threads work as expected across all of the DAWs that I'm supporting, and you can fill in the blank here. So
I just had a look actually. In Reaper, the current limit is for live effects multiprocessing. So if you have tracks that are record armed or otherwise dependent on things that input, that there's a limit of 32 threads, and for total threads, in addition to that, which would be the anticipative multiprocessing and media reading and sample rate conversion and all of that, there's 64. So
okay, oh cool, very, very good. Well, now that's going to lead us into the next area that I want to discuss, and I touched on it on the first show, and this is about the hybrid playback engines. And my personal feeling is that the further that these hybrid playback engines are being developed and implemented, kind of the lazier the core engine is becoming. And I was using Cubase as an example, where Cubase 6.5, and Erin can chip in here because, I mean, he's been a long-term Cubase user as well, but Cubase 6.5, that was the last version pre-AAVIM when they started bringing the hybrid engines in. That was so efficient at whatever respective latency you were playing at. You knew exactly where the bodies were buried, and it was very, very efficient. And then as the hybrid engine was starting to be implemented, so at Cubase 7, for example, it was only plugins, not virtual instruments. And then Cubase 8, they introduced the hybrid playback engine into the virtual instruments as well, and then it's developed again for 9, 9.5, and 10. Now, at each successive version, in my opinion, if you turn AAVIM off, we were seeing a very distinct performance drop compared to 6.5, for example. And even to the point with Cubase 10, there's another curve that's been thrown that we've only just recently discovered, where the hybrid engine is not actually working as expected, in the sense that if you turn it off, you actually get better performance, which is totally against the whole premise of the thing. So,
well, let's look at this for a second. Just as I don't know anything about Cubase, but as a software developer, the question I would have would be, okay, so between 6.5 and then they have subsequent releases where they add ASIO guard, and if you turn ASIO guard off, then you have an overall decrease in performance from 6.5 to 7 or whatever it is, and so on. So why do you think that is? Do you think, and you said, you know, is the engine being lazier or whatever, but so do you think that it's that the addition of ASIO guard added overhead that then is just, even when it's not being used, it's slowing everything down because it's checking it? Or is it because that they added new features to the mixing engine that then slow things down? That you're also getting a benefit from that. So it's not necessarily the addition of it, but it's that they did other things that have costs associated with them. And then the possibility is that they went in and just decided that they were going to just make everything slow, which wouldn't make much sense, but you know, who knows?
look, I think it could be a combination of all of the above.
Well, I should stress, I was joking about the last one. There's no reason for them to go update code to make it slower. There's just no benefit whatsoever to that.
No, I think, and again, I'm not a coder, but my personal feeling is that they're using the ASIO guard as a bit of a crutch because it masks the inefficiencies that have been brought into the engine.
But why do you think it got less efficient?
But again, I don't, not being a coder, I don't know. Is it laziness, or is it, as you've actually suggested, that they've added additional features, and also the implementation of ASIO guard, even being switched off, has actually placed further overhead on top. So
yeah, I mean, I think that's the real thing, is that either they added new things that slowed it down, or they fixed bugs that, you know, maybe certain things weren't sample accurate before, but then they fixed that issue. And when they do that, they probably don't advertise it, because it would be like, you know, hey, look how broken we were. And then the other thing is that maybe adding ASIO guard actually added a bunch of overhead that even when it's disabled, like it doesn't work. Things don't work as well as they used to.
And that's probably the most likely answer, I would suggest.
I think it's the first one is the more likely answer, personally.
Which is, sorry.
which is the first one being that they did other changes, that they made other improvements that had a cost associated with them.
I think that on the earlier versions, when we'll say 7 to 9 and 9.5, but version 10 is there is a distinct problem going on where if you have ASIO guard on any of those other versions, you would see at a respective latency, you're obviously going to see an increase. When I say obviously, where you're going to see an increase in performance of a total number of plugins or polyphony because you are playing at that higher playback buffer. Now with Cubase, the default is 23 milliseconds, which I've been informed is 23 milliseconds additional to the hardware buffer. But it wasn't working exactly as you'd expect. So if you're adding 23 milliseconds to, say, 6 milliseconds, you've got a 29 millisecond playback buffer. Or if you're adding 23 milliseconds to a 3 millisecond playback buffer, you're still dealing with that really large buffer. I wouldn't be expecting a huge variance in performance, but it is measurable, and it doesn't really make any sense to me, and it still doesn't, why that would be the case when you are dealing with this large playback buffer. So there are other elements that are dependent.
It actually kind of does make sense to me that.
Does it? Okay, awesome.
So let me hypothesize about what Cubase's ASIO guard mode is doing from what my guess would be, which is that, so you suppose you have a 3 millisecond buffer for your project, and then you have the 23 millisecond of the hybrid buffer. And so when you go to play your project, all of the tracks that are not record armed, that are not super latency sensitive, they're rendered with a 23 millisecond buffer. So that's like 1,024 samples at 44K or whatever. So it renders a block of all of those, and then when it goes to go play out of your 3 millisecond buffer, which is 64 samples, I guess. Sorry, my math skills. Then it takes that 1,024 sample block and it just starts sending it 64 samples at a time to the master or to the output, right?
Right.
And then as it's doing that, once it's partway through, it goes ahead and just at a lower priority, it renders the next 1,024 samples and so on. So that when it gets to that buffer, it can start sending those 1,024 samples, 64 samples at a time to the audio device.
Okay.
So the difference is the CPU utilization, the per block overhead that you have for rendering each of these 1,024 samples blocks is going to be the same whether or not your hardware device is running at 1,024 samples or it's running at 32 samples or 64 samples or whatever. So like that overhead will be the same, but there's still going to be the per block overhead of sending those blocks and dealing with the entire project level processing and all the overhead that's just associated with processing a sample block for a given project or whatnot. So on top of that, you have another issue, which is that when you're sending these small blocks of audio from the audio thread, the 64 sample blocks, you have a certain amount of time that you can do that, and that you can do all of your processing. And if you exceed a certain amount of time, if it's a 3 millisecond block, it's probably like you have about 3 to 4 milliseconds. Like you can go over occasionally, but you can't go over too often, or you're gonna underrun the device.
Correct. Yep.
So as a result of this, as you use more and more CPU from all of these other tasks that are processing audio in larger blocks, you're going to have a certain amount of leeway, and the smaller your audio device buffer is, just the less leeway you have just to deal with scheduling issues and lock contention and all of these things that end up occurring. And then there's also other factors, but there could be cache thrash and things like that. So basically you just have less leeway. So you're more likely to end up running into a problem as the CPU utilization gets high, even though you have these fixed size blocks.
Well, that's because it's been, as you explained, you've got the fixed size blocks, but they're still being, they're being forced through the hardware block buffer.
Right.
So there's that dependency there. And that explains perfectly the query that I had where I wasn't quite understanding how, depending on what the hardware buffer setting was, we were getting some variable in the benchmark results. And so that explains that 100% for me. So my understanding, which was wrong, was that the hybrid playback engines, now this is, I'm pretty sure this is how the Logic one worked. It was just at a set playback buffer. For example, it was 512, 1024, 2048. And I don't think the hardware buffer was actually coming into play there, because those benchmark results, it doesn't matter where the hardware buffer was, if nothing was track armed, I would get exactly the same benchmark results no matter where the hardware buffer was. And this is what was throwing me a little bit with what was happening with AJ Guard. It wasn't a huge variance, but there was some there.
You were saying if no track was record armed.
No track was record armed, so nothing was being forced through the hardware buffer.
So then maybe what Logic does is it runs everything at the higher latency until it gets to the device, and until that last little bit. Whereas Cubase is probably doing it at the track level or something like that, so that it still has some higher level mixing that happens at the lower block size.
Yep. And look, Logic, as soon as that was the problem with Logic, where you'd had huge overhead when you were mixing, but if you wanted to do a drop in and you had to track arm, there was a good potential that the session would collapse itself because it was getting forced back to that lower buffer. But all of these hybrid engines, again, this is a continuation of a discussion we had in the first show. I mean, they're not really all created, they're not created equal at all. Studio One has some issues at the moment since they implemented that hybrid engine. Whether it's directly related, I mean, there's really not a consensus whether it's directly related, but it kind of coincided with the introduction of the hybrid engine, and they were starting to get some real issues with higher core count machines. So if you're dealing with a 6-core machine, you weren't really seeing the issues that the guys that were running a 12 or 14-core machine were. And what seems to be happening is that there's just this huge resource overhead. It's not quite spiking because the load is actually consistent, but it's kind of collapsing sessions that would comfortably run at, say, 25% on the earlier version, and all of a sudden they're trying to run exactly the same session with the same plugin templates, and they're tipping into the 80s and 90s, and it's just inoperable. And I've had one client that was forced off Studio One because of that, and you'd be happy to know that he's actually landed on Reaper. And after initial, grumbling under the breath about, it's too hard to get my head over, get around, and all the rest of it, he just loves it. He's got his workflow set up now, and he ain't going back. But apart from Reaper, I don't know. I think you're the last holdout as far as hybrid playback engines, because I know Samplitude's had one for ages.
What about Ableton?
No, that's right. Ableton doesn't have one.
Yeah, I think the anticipative effects processing it works well enough. I mean, I guess the problem with it is that it does effectively have higher latency.
Can you actually give us an oversight on that compared to because there's people that have said to me in the past, no, Reaper's got a hybrid playback engine, and I've gone, no, it hasn't, and they've gone, yes, it has. The anticipative engine is a hybrid. I've gone, okay.
It depends on what you define hybrid as, I guess, but what Reaper does is, instead of using, rendering a block of audio for each track that's 1,000 samples long ahead, it renders a bunch of blocks of the native sample block size. So if you're running at 64 samples of an audio device buffer, then it'll render a couple hundred milliseconds, or whatever the configured amount is, ahead of time for that track, so that when it goes to play it, it can just pull a block from the queue and mix it in and continue. So that's how it works. It's very simple.
Okay, but there is an enormous performance advantage having it on compared to having it off. And I think Erin can chime in here, because we were doing some production stuff together last week, and the session was quite heavy in regards to processing. I said, what happens if you turn the anticipative processing off? And he says, well, it won't play, pretty much. Erin, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I found I can run sessions, like much heavier sessions than in anything else, with that engine on. So I run some pretty ridiculously heavy sessions where I've got some very heavy sample library, contact instances and play, etc., all running live, which are going into kind of complex bus routing, basically so I can supply mastered stems, etc. So everything kind of runs live, and I kind of mix as I write in these sessions, and then end up having a lot of really heavy plugins down the chain. And yeah, I find I can run these sessions, and it's quite incredible how far I can push it. I do find I need to, if I'm kind of starting to go back kind of into the earlier stages of the sessions and rewrite MIDI, or I need to track arm and play something in, I generally need to turn off all my bus processing, and that kind of makes sense after what you were saying before, Justin, about how if you've got a number of tracks routed to like a group bus that's got some really heavy plugins, that's not going to be spread over cores, obviously. So that's probably where I come into those issues there. But that being said, you can very quickly just disarm the plugins on those buses, on those kind of master buses, kind of instantly, and it just unloads them, which is great. So that's kind of my workflow. But yeah, I find I wouldn't be able to run these sessions on anything else, really.
Actually, what's interesting is that also the amount of, if the hybrid modes have like 23 milliseconds of buffer, in Reaper, it's usually for the anticipative, it's usually 100 milliseconds or 200 milliseconds, which is a lot. And so what it lets you do is, if you have some plugins that end up being really slow at times, or if it has to pull a sample from the disk and the disk is slow and it takes it 50 milliseconds to get the sample from the disk, that is actually is enough buffer so that it doesn't interrupt your playback for really slow plugins, or for plugins that spike the CPU because they're doing a bunch of FFTs or something like that. So it has that advantage of giving you even more buffer without sacrificing. So if you're recording at low latency on another track that isn't related to that, it can still run at low latency.
Yeah.
That explains, Erin, what we were seeing when you had that session running with all of the heavy processing and you were pressing stop, and then it was not stuttering, but it was basically unloading. It felt like it was unloading the buffer.
Yeah, but that was like multiple heavy sampled instruments running live through these buses, and then the buses had some really heavy plugins, like very high latency, heavy processing, mastering plugins essentially.
And if plugins use PDC, it's compensating for delay, then sometimes you'll have that buffer will flush out as well.
That's exactly what it was doing. It was flushing the buffer out when you were pressing stop.
Yeah, and I'm always looking at that, and these plugins are adding a lot of latency kind of when you get to those buses. But look, the workflow really for me is it's kind of going between two different modes. Generally kind of traditionally you'd compose everything and create it all, and then you do a mix, but I kind of do everything at once. But you can just literally just highlight the buses and just turn everything off, and it instantly goes off. Then there's absolutely none of that going on. There's no kind of unloading or anything because it's not processing. But the fact you can just turn it off so smoothly is great, which that's kind of the latest workflow I've been working with, and it works really well. It's good. And plus I get all the advantages of being able to run these sessions that are, bordering on ridiculous. Which is good.
Yeah.
Right on.
I can actually vouch for that, Justin. The amount of stuff that was going on in those sessions was amazing. And this was just, we were producing the first DAWbench show, which I thought, wow, how much could possibly be going on with, 3 dialogue voices? But it was just amazing, the amount of stuff that was running. Oh, actually, no, that was our, that was the remix of the intro. That's right. That's the one that had massive amounts of virtual instruments and effects processing and sound design, and that was the one that was we were seeing the flushing of the buffers on. There we go.
One other thing I'd like to say, one function of Reaper which is just incredible for scoring the picture is sub-projects. That's just an insane feature. Essentially you can have like a project per cue when you're scoring a film. And they just, sub-projects are like clips. You have a big master project, and that allows you to, kind of zoom in and out of, different tempo, maps and all this kind of stuff for different cues. So, you can have like a cue with 200 to 300 tracks running, all in surround, all being mixed, and then, just hit save and it updates the master project. So that's like a real game changer, I reckon, particularly for my workflow, that whole sub-project concept, and the fact you can kind of go Inception style on it and have sub-projects within sub-projects within sub-projects. It can get pretty crazy, but you can basically manage anything, really.
Just don't do the time stretch like like an Inception, or it'll just it'll be in there for 80 years of audio.
Yeah, I know.
That's awesome. Look, one last question that I've got, Justin, or it might not be the last question, depending on how this keeps flowing. But future development, is there anything that is really you want to actually accomplish with Reaper in regards to any feature sets? Or actually, no, that's kind of we can't go talking about that.
Well, I've been having a good few weeks of improving some things that I wrote 12 or 13 years ago.
For Reaper?
For Reaper, yeah. So like there's, a bunch of what I guess is called technical debt that is now it's time to repay. So yeah, I've been enjoying that.
Technical debt. I like that.
That's like a thing that people talk about in software development. So it's the design decisions you make that end up being something that you pay interest on every time you go to update a particular piece of code, or that people experience less than ideal performance in certain situations. And so I've been finally, ending the procrastination of certain things. So there's good stuff to come, I suppose. But on the other side of that coin is a million little things will break as a result of that. So,
of course, working as designed or working as non-designed.
Yeah. So, going back to the beginning, yes, don't rewrite anything, if you can avoid it.
Yeah. Well, look, one of the features that I spoke to Erin about was, and a few other people have actually brought it up as well, is just the implementation of your video within Reaper. And video and audio. So if you've made a small change to a section of, a film or a TV show, and the editor wants, or the producer wants, just that small comp, just to be able to bounce the audio and video together for that, say, 30-second comp, you would think it'd be something very simple, but some of the major DAWs can't do it. And that's one thing that I know that Reaper can do, and a few others can. But there's some that is still an omission on some of the major DAWs, which are used quite extensively within for film and TV composition. So that just blows my mind that something as simple as that cannot be implemented on some of the other DAWs.
Well, in all fairness, it's not that simple.
Okay. Sorry. Well, okay. From an end user perspective, you would think it'd be something that simple. So well, obviously, you're telling me it isn't that simple. So the video engine in Reaper, what's that based? Is it QuickTime or
I use VLC for mine.
We support VLC and FFmpeg, and on the Mac, AV Foundation to do decoding and to do encoding as well. AV Foundation or FFmpeg, both.
Okay, so everything's moved away from QuickTime, thankfully.
Yeah, no, QuickTime. I don't think Apple even uses QuickTime anymore because it's ancient, but yeah, internally, it uses these things to encode and decode, but internally, Reaper converts everything to a native color space format, and there's a bunch of processing capabilities that we've built in that are done in a very programmer-friendly, scripty way. But it's something that I made for my own video hacking fun uses, and that's actually a lot of fun to play with if you have an eye towards programming, especially.
Yeah. And you can do some basic video editing within Reaper as well, can't you? Or am I mistaken there?
Yeah, you can do a lot actually.
Do titles and streamers and
Really?
You can do chroma key and transitions, and actually I have a YouTube channel of a bunch of video of like some music videos I made, sort of testing out and coming up with new effects that they're all about like maybe 3 or 4 years old. But actually, come to think of it, there are some more recent ones where I took like one of those cheapo 360 cameras that captures pretty much everything, and then import that into the project with the audio and sync them up, and then wrote some processors to like unwrap the 360 into like 2 slices that then rotate around, and then you put like an oscilloscope on top of it of the music being played. You can have a lot of fun with it all.
Oh, that sounds really cool. So is that on YouTube?
Yeah. And or also on my blog, if you scroll down enough, there's a bunch of random videos.
Right. Okay. Cool.
In places. Yeah.
Awesome.
I should say my blog, not the Ask Justin Frankel blog, but I have another webpage that has all the stuff I make on it, music and videos and blah blah blah.
All right. Cool.
Okay. Well, I'll get that address a bit later. Maybe just drop it into the description just so that people can actually find it. I want to check that out myself.
I've got one question. Just the name Reaper. Is there any history on that? And the logo and everything? Yeah, because I think it's cool.
Thanks. Not really. I mean, originally it was the name that I picked because it was like trying to reap the product of all the music I was trying to play, and things like that. So, and then it became a backronym of a backronym being where you make an acronym out of a word and then figure out what the letters mean.
A backronym.
Actually, I thought it was an acronym of something, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it was then, once I liked it as Reaper, then it was the Rapid Environment for Audio Prototyping and Efficient Recording or something.
There you go. Because that's a question that Erin asked me last week, and I said, I'm sure it's an acronym. But now you're telling me it's a backronym.
I like that it came like that. Like I always thought like Reaper as in like, it's kind of reaping the music kind of thing. And it's cool to know that that's where it's actually stemmed from. Yeah.
Yes, it's a happy music harvest.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not about death or anything.
No, I know. Well, yeah, I kind of like that. Like, yeah, it's kind of, it's cool.
And then the logo, I think that's at this point White Tie's work. I don't remember originally, but the whole like the nice guitar pick feel to it is,
very good. Well, I've got something that I probably should have asked a bit earlier, Justin, is just the whole culture, company culture, and the way you structure your pricing is pretty unique, and it's, pretty integral to your whole approach, I feel.
Well, I guess there are a few things I could say. We run, I think we run the company in a way it's like where we don't want to be doing stuff that we don't want to be doing. Like you want to make software that you want to use and that you want it to be, you want to just have as little bullshit as possible. And so I think most of our decisions are sort of shaped by that, which is like, we don't deal with marketing or things like that. We don't do deals to, distribute other people's things or to cross promotional things. We don't go to trade shows because who wants to go to a trade show? Maybe it's fun when you're like 20 or something, but I don't got time for that. I don't like meetings with people. We don't have an office we go to. I have a studio that I go to test things and to have it as an environment for working, but that's it. We're geographically distributed because people want to live where they want to live, and that's the way it should be. So that's sort of the thing ultimately is like, we don't want to deal with writing copy protection because that's the worst job ever. Writing plugin compatibility is a close second probably, but that's our own whack-a-mole of you fix one thing and you break another. But anyway, the main thing is like this is something that we really enjoy doing and care about, and so we should try to make sure that we are enjoying it and continue to care about it. And so that sort of shapes everything. And the pricing structure is sort of originally was like, oh, well, no one's going to take you seriously if you're $50. So let's make them pay more if they're serious. But I think most of our users qualify for discounted licenses. But there are quite a few big companies that buy commercial licenses too. And I think if you're a big company, that's the $225 is really not much.
Oh, I think it's very reasonable, definitely. Yeah, I think the pricing structure, because I was lecturing at a university a couple of years ago and teaching sound design, and a lot of the students, they couldn't actually afford to buy Pro Tools, which is what we were learning there. And so, I was able to suggest Reaper. I said, check this out. You can do so much with it. And it really kind of blew their minds. They were able to use it without, having to have a dongle, iLok or something like that. Small install, and they could pretty much do whatever they needed with that. So I think it's great because it opens up the opportunity for people that might not have the finances to, pay $600 or $1,000 or some crazy subscription fee. And it's also kind of open. They can test it out, and then they can get a very reasonably priced license, and then they can kind of customize it to do whatever they need. So I think it's a really positive thing.
Yeah, thanks.
It's great.
Yeah. Well, I think for me, it's the way that you've approached it is less money driven and more feature driven or community driven. And that's what's always appealed to me as well, not only because of the efficiency and the performance of the DAW and the feature set. It's just that approach, which is very, very unique. And it's something that needs to be applauded, I think, Justin. And it's, I can understand why the other software companies can't actually implement that type of company structure, because they're just, a lot larger, and there's a lot of, they just become, more compartmentalized and more behemoths, and they're answering to, a lot of people above them. Majority of those major DAW companies have all been on-sold or acquired. Steinberg's been sold on twice. Cakewalk was moving around like a bad penny there for a while, and then I think they've landed where they've landed now. Now it's actually free, which is look, I don't really do much with Cakewalk, but that was another company that was moving around a lot. Pro Tools as well was acquired by Avid. So your approach is very, very unique, and it is something that needs to be kind of stated and I think applauded. So there you go.
Oh, thank you. It is a nice niche to inhabit.
Yeah, sure. and it is something that you gain my respect very, very early on from that whole approach, and you still maintain my respect for that. And the DAW just keeps delivering. It just keeps delivering, performance-wise. We're doing the comparative performance stuff. We've had to drop Cubase out of the DAWbench testing at the moment because of the inconsistencies and the idiosyncrasies of the engine at the moment. So we're moving all of the testing over to Reaper now. And that's going to be pretty much where it's going to stay, I believe, because there is a consistency to the performance of the engine, where the other ones, it seems to be a bit of a crapshoot at the moment. And that just comes back to there's yourself and one other coder dealing with it. So the left hand's knowing what the right hand's doing all the time. So I think that is very, very important as well.
And when some things go wrong, I know who to blame.
Yeah.
This guy right here.
Yeah. Instead of everyone pointing the finger going, hey, it's not my problem. It's not my problem. And let me tell you, I've encountered that before, between the developers, the QA, the product managers, the product support, everyone's pointing the finger elsewhere because, when there's a problem, there's a lot of people that you can point the finger at if you don't want to take accountability for it. So you don't really have, there's nowhere for you to hide, mate. There's only you and
yeah. I tell you, if you don't like being criticized, don't post anything to the internet. That's for sure.
Yeah.
The internets. Yeah. Everyone's an armchair expert, Justin, And I'm sure all of us have encountered it at some point, but we didn't bring it up earlier. But, we were accused, when I say we, it was more so me. You got dragged into it as well, that we were accused of compiling the RXC plugin to specifically favor Intel in some way. And, there's some guy that come up and he's posting up all this technical data saying this is the compiler that's being used and the test is specifically skewed towards Intel and against AMD. And I remember reaching out to you, and I can't remember how many plugins we ended up compiling with different compilers, but you did a fair few. And when we sat down and tested every single one of them, and every other one fell on its ass, every single one. And even funnier that the one that was specified as the most AMD friendly actually collapsed on the AMD machines.
Yeah, there's a science fiction author named Cory Doctorow, and he wrote a piece recently about just an article, a nonfiction piece about how, if we want to have less conspiracy theories, we have to stop having so many actual conspiracies, or having things that frankly look like conspiracies.
Yeah.
And Intel did have an instance where their compiler was purposely producing bad code that would only run on non-Intel chips.
Right. But that's not the one you were using, though.
It wasn't the one we used, but the fact that Intel had done that made it really difficult for you to be able to say, no, that's definitely not this one, because it's like, well, they did do that, but this isn't that, and so it is not good that Intel did do that. But yeah, as far as I know, the versions of the Intel compilers, they don't run as optimally on AMD chips, but it's not like an intentional thing. It's more of taking advantage of newer features,
right? Yeah,
in Intel CPUs. Well, interestingly enough, there is something related now, which is we recently, in the last year, switched to using the latest Intel compiler for the Mac builds, whereas previously we were using an older version of the Intel compiler. But so people have reported that if you run it on a Hackintosh that's running a Ryzen CPU, it actually just doesn't work. It crashes.
Oops. Well, that's more to do with OS X, though. Wouldn't it have to be something to do?
Yeah. I mean, it is the Intel compiler's fault in a way, but it's also that a Ryzen CPU is not officially supported in Mac OS, so there should be no expectation that anything works. But so yeah, it's like it's a quandary for us. Like, what do we do about that?
Well, you don't cater to the Hackintosh community. I mean, that's just a given.
Yeah,
you can't cater to them. There's more and more of them actually coming into the fold because over the years there's just a growing number of Mac users that have been very disgruntled with the direction that the hardware has been heading. And look, in the past, you couldn't even say the word Hackintosh on gear slots, for example. I mean, as soon as you mention Hackintosh, they would shut the thread down because they were freaking out about the possibility of legal implications from Apple themselves. Now, you go on there and they're sitting there and there's 100-page threads, thousands of posts on there, and they're all carrying on about how to build a Hackintosh. And I'm going, I don't understand. And this is on... Funnily, this is on the new Mac Pro thread where they're going, would you want to buy one of those? You can build one of these for X amount of dollars. And I've gone, I don't understand how this conversation is even allowed here, because there is still a legal consequence to it.
Well, I don't think there's a legal consequence to talking about it.
There's no legal consequence? Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, gear slots were very guarded in the past about it, Justin. I can vouch for that.
Yeah. No, I'm sure they want to avoid getting like cease and desist or people linking to stuff that's, copyrighted Apple material or things like that. But I would be really surprised if talking about how to make a Hackintosh would be considered infringement in any way.
Yeah. Look, it's a gray area. I mean, I played with it in the past, and I did it only for my internal testing. I've had a few people approach me, can you build me a Hackintosh? I said, no, there's no way. Go hit the internet, do it yourself. There's no way I'm putting my name on any of this stuff. I did it for myself to do some cross-platform performance testing, which created, a huge wave of interest in what I was testing, but also there was a lot of controversy because the Hackintosh was outperforming the real hardware, but not by a little bit, by quite substantial amount.
I wouldn't imagine Apple cares about enthusiasts doing it as well. I think their big thing is probably they don't want people selling Hackintoshes.
Correct. Yeah, no, they did stomp on that very, very quickly. And I just think they just, it's not even a fly in the ointment, it's not even a blip on the radar for them, so they'll just continue on. But the new Mac Pro approach is very, very interesting. They've priced it, significantly higher than what a lot of people are expecting, and that's what was causing, a lot of the grumbling, so to speak, and the calls for the, let's do a mass protest and all build Hackintoshes type of thing. I thought, I don't think they're really going to be too perturbed. They're going to sell enough of them. Doesn't matter what the price point is.
Yeah, I don't think they make any money on. They don't make much money on Macs in general.
No,
it's all about
no
phones.
Well, yeah, it's all the peripheral, entertainment devices, I would say. Yeah. But look, it's all very, very interesting. We've had, I've had my own qualms with Windows 10 over the last 4 years as well. So how have you been finding it within your Reaper development?
I don't use it much anymore. I mostly actually use Linux and Macs at this point. But I've been doing some stuff with it, and it was nice to see the latest update. They pretty much resolved the issue with a limitation on the fiber local storage handles. Not to go into the weeds there, but a lot of people had issues where if you used a lot of different kinds of plugins that were linked with different standard libraries, that if you tried to insert one more plugin, then it just wouldn't load. And so the Windows 10 update that came out this year resolves that. It increases the limit to a very reasonable amount.
Oh, I know. It's a ridiculous amount.
Yeah.
It was previously 100, 128.
It's previously 100. And now it's 4,000.
Well, and the problem, look, some people didn't see it at all. And it really depended on the plugin you were using. But things like the Arturia analog station or analog, it was their environment where you could run multiple instances of their analog model synths. That was taking 50 before you even put a plugin into it. And it's like, what?
And if you used any old synthetic plugins, those also used a ton too.
So there you go. So yes, that's been awesome that they implemented that. There was another little quirk with it though, that it wasn't related to the FLS fix, but there was, actually I can't go into what it was, but there was an increase in the DPC latency, and quite a significant increase. So I put a test build onto my system, one of my development systems here, and the DPC latency usually sits around 80, somewhere around there. Maybe the NVIDIA driver will kick in and puts it up to about 150 or so, which is well within working. That is not going to be causing any problems.
Yeah.
But
you're talking microseconds.
Yeah, 150 micro.
Yeah,
and then all of a sudden, I put 1903 on the first build, and I do all my optimizations, and I run a DPC latency test, and it's all looking good. It's all sitting there, in the real time, sitting at about 15, 20, and we get this occasional thing up to 80, 150, and then we got this 3,000, this huge spike, into the 3,000s. I went, wow, what happened there? And it was only being reported as a kernel spike, kernel issue, and so you couldn't track it down. So I spent weeks disabling hardware, what piece of hardware is actually causing this. And it wasn't hardware at all. There was actually something that they'd introduced at the kernel level within the build. I'm kind of privy, but I'm not going to say what it was. But they actually did resolve it. And, that was Pete Brown from Microsoft who got that across the line. So he needs that's a golf clap to Pete. He'll be listening in at some point. He's awesome. He does a lot of stuff for us, getting fixes across the line. He also got the MMC. It was an unofficial fix, but he got that to us. Various DAW builders that. And I remember I emailed you about that MMC problem where
The MMCSS one,
Yeah.
or the high priority
Yeah.
thread scheduling.
MMCSS. Yep, that one there where there was 32 threads available, but each call made 2 calls. So then all of a sudden that halved, and 4 were taken by the operating system. So we were left with 14. So anything above a 6-core CPU, there was a chance of some thread collision stuff happening. I don't know if thread collision is actually the right term, but there was a problem where the threads were not going to be processed correctly, and anything above a 6-core. Now, that was pretty devastating. So here I am selling 8, 10, 12, 14, 16-core machines, and the things are absolutely crippled. And when I say crippled, they were crippled. You couldn't do anything with them. And then we got this unofficial MMCSS patch. We'll call it a patch. I can tell you now, it's a registry entry, but it's unofficial. But they did give it to us, and we can apply this patch, and it all went away. It was amazing because we just raised the thread limit to 128, and off we went. Now that went to a few of us, the dedicated DAW builders, and it also went to Steinberg, who were directly affected. I don't know about the other DAWs because I do remember I messaged you directly about it, and you have different modes for it. And I can't remember the exact detail, but you did send me a detailed email, and you said that it's not going to be affected, but there was a mode that if we actually clicked it in, that could be causing an issue. Do you remember that conversation at all, Justin?
I don't specifically. I think my vague recollection is that it was less than ideal, but it wouldn't be catastrophic.
Yeah. But you do actually have a setting in that engine that specifically mentions MMCSS optimization, or whether it's an optimization or not, I'm not sure. But
right, you can choose whether or not to use it for the sort of the real-time audio threads. Yeah,
right, and so the default is off.
The default is on. I think the main thing was that it only really affected the live effects multiprocessing.
Right,
and if you used anticipative, which most people do, and is the most effective, then it doesn't matter for that because it has so much latency built into it. And yeah.
Right. Okay. There you go. That's why you circumnavigate it. Well, you didn't circumnavigate it. You're just not affected by it. But I mean, Cubase was really the only one. I think they invested a lot of optimization into that MMCSS area, and because Windows 7 didn't have the limitation, they were absolutely blindsided by Windows 10, I suspect. It's supposedly fixed in 10, Cubase 10. Why am I not sounding convinced? Because I'm not convinced. I still run the MMCSS patch on all the machines that I send out, even the ones running Cubase 10. There is just a gut feel that I don't think it's completely resolved. Just seeing the behavior of Cubase 10 of late. They fixed one thing and maybe broke a few others. But I still run the patch because I'm not quite sure whether the other DAWs are affected or not, but running the patch doesn't hurt the system, and it's just, a bit of a safety buffer for myself and all the clients that are running it. Mind you, any Windows update actually overwrites it, has to get reapplied every time. So yes, that's why it remains unofficial. It can never be a permanent fix. Very odd area for that patch to be run in. And again, I'm not a coder, but my understanding is that it's not an area of the registry that is usually used or allowed to be written to. And so anytime there's an update, the Windows update sees it as some type of rogue entry and deletes it, and we have to run it again. Does that make any sense, Justin?
Yeah, I mean, I guess they probably want to make sure that things are back at the stock settings so that if there was an issue caused by it, it would be fixed.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, it's something that they are not totally comfortable with changing as the default.
Oh, no, they're not comfortable with changing it at all. I mean, it took a lot of mediation to actually get that across, and communication and writing reports, and it took quite a while to get it across. And then we were just handed the fix, no explanation, with the caveat saying, this is not official. You can run it if you like, but it's not official. And I went, well, That was the only way pre-Cubase 10 for my Cubase users above 6 cores to actually get the expected performance. And when you see the difference, I've got a before and after shot of a 16-core machine running flat out with all 32 threads loaded, and the ASIO meter is sitting in the 95 percentiles, and it's rock solid, where before it wouldn't even run a couple of tracks of audio with some, Arturia plugins. It was just completely crippled. So it was night and day different. So, there was always the argument that I'm not seeing the arms getting crossed. I'm not seeing this problem. So, I think you're kind of, it doesn't affect that many people, but it was when I've got half a dozen clients going, hey, I've just bought this new 10, 12 core machine and it's doing worse than my old 6 core, then, we had, we had a problem and I had to resolve it very, very quickly. So, Cubase's resolution was you ran this patch and it would limit the engine to 7 cores, which is kind of pretty useless when you've got a 10 core or a 12 core or a 14 core. But it actually stabilized the machine for them to use it in the interim until we actually got the patch across. So, but I wouldn't call that a fix. That was just a Band-Aid. We'll call it a Band-Aid.
Workaround, yes.
So it is going to be interesting with the core counts increasing, and we have covered that. But I'm not convinced that we're going to be seeing DAWs comfortably threading across, 50 plus cores. Not anytime soon. But I suppose it's, it's something that you guys as developers would need to be looking at, because again, the core counts are rising, and the CPU pricing is coming down. So it's going to be getting into an area where it's a lot more affordable and there's a lot more users are going to be into that higher core count.
Yeah, yes and no. I think, the whether there's really demand for it is another question.
Well, how high a demand would probably be.
Yeah.
So I don't know what the snapshot of the Reaper users are, but are the majority of them still at that 6-core type of area, or?
No idea.
Yeah. Erin?
I have no idea either. No.
I do think most people do not run massive projects.
Yeah.
Obviously there are users who do, and they tend to be, they probably tend to be vocal about issues that they have. But for the most part, I think most people do not need massive core counts.
And I suppose you have to, then if you do start running into the issues with those higher core counts, you have to weigh up the time taken to assign to that in comparison to the actual size of the user base that are running into those issues.
The biggest issue I seem to come up against is plugins that have a lot of, they need a lot of plugin delay compensation. And I know, question for you guys, would, having many more cores and CPU power, is that going to make any difference if you've got a plugin that's got, quite a massive plugin delay going on? Because that's kind of where projects get sluggish, start, stop, and all that kind of thing, especially when you've got these plugins piled on top of each other through multiple buses, for example. Does CPU power actually bring down that delay, or is that delay just inherent?
Well, it's not going to bring it down, but the ability to process it will be more clock speed than core count.
I would agree with that. Though, and additionally, well, some plugin delay compensation is because you actually need to have the look ahead, and other is because you want to find ways of doing the same processing more efficiently that requires more data at a time.
Right.
So to the extent that you can make plugin delay compensation versus processing power trade-offs, maybe plugin developers can find ways of increasing the processing power required but reducing the delay.
Yeah.
Which would be nice, depending on what.
That would be good. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that'd be kind of the ultimate, that we can have 50 cores or 100 cores and then have very little latency. But yeah, a lot of these plugins, they seem to have the latency built into it, particularly things like linear phase and limiters, particularly mastering type plugins. As soon as you engage them, it's just like, because I'm always looking at the stats on I can't remember what it is, but there's a window I bring up on Reaper, and it shows me what plugin delay compensation is for each track and bus. You can see when you enable these plugins, it's just like bang. It's like,
yeah,
and it really affects performance, but that's just part and parcel of that plugin, essentially.
There are some things. There is some, if you will, technical debt in Reaper as far as how plugin delay compensation is handled. That is not ideal and could be improved, but I can't tell you when that would ever change.
Yeah,
it may at some point, but it may not.
Yeah, but I think with the individual plugin overheads that Erin is talking about, that's more clock and IPC than actual, the number of cores. It's more the actual inherent efficiency of the architecture.
Yeah, though there's also, additional work that has to be done in order to deal with PDC that Reaper handles maybe not as well as it could. So there's also room for the hosts to improve performance in those sort of scenarios.
Okay, so and just to finish off and with the question that Erin was asking, would more cores help? No,
not necessarily. No,
yeah.
But I think the thing is, clock speed will help, and also optimizing the DAW would help as well.
Yeah, and IPC and
but also optimizing the session. I think
that too. Yes.
Yeah, and like your comment about having the convolution on each track because it spreads it across the cores, whereas traditional mixing is you're using auxiliaries and busing. Coming from analog mixing, you have one reverb unit or one master bus compressor, but as deliveries change and I'm delivering more things, more jobs as stems, I've got to deliver multiple aspects of a piece of music, split up to 10 or 12 parts, and then all of those generally need to sound like they're mastered. It's not going to sound like it would be squashed through a master bus limiter, but when my client sums them all together, it'll sound like it's mastered. So you're essentially spreading a session across mastering plugins across multiple buses. But then now I'm thinking, is there a way that I can work sessions where it's kind of more focused on single tracks even more so to spread it across cores, particularly if core count's going to expand. That could be a way to get more efficient sessions happening. It's just having to think a different way rather than the traditional mixing way.
And it's important to note the distinction between, since you mentioned both a reverb unit and a master bus compressor, that that compressors will behave differently if you run multiple of them versus summing and then sending through the compressor.
Oh, of course, yeah,
because it's nonlinear versus a reverb or an EQ, which is generally linear. So
yeah, definitely. I mean, that's right. If you're summing things together if you're using a compressor for a particular sound, although I have experimented with side chaining. Like master bus limiters. So you essentially send a side chain of the sum of all the parts into the limiter, and then that limiter is reacting to the side chain, and then that will limit each individual stem individually, and when summed together, it's very, very close to the original. But the weird thing you get there is on the individual stems, particularly down the end of the chain, if a client's wanting to mute a certain part, the other track's actually they're reacting to that limiter. So you might get, if you have a pad or something, it'll end up ducking where the drums would come through, for example.
Right.
So it's kind of like you can kind of get around that to an extent. You can get it very close where the stems are separate and they'll sum together and they'll sound very close to as if you had everything running through a 2-bus mix setup. But there is downsides to that too. So you're constantly juggling these things and trying to figure out the best way to do it. And so it's an interesting one. But I think it's that whole thing of thinking outside the box. I mean, coming to Reaper, it changed kind of the way that I think about using a DAW, because obviously there's one type of track. So, and I love that. And I have icons for different. I create an audio track or an instrument track or an auxiliary track or a bus VCA just so visually I can kind of differentiate between them all. But you got to think a different way when you got one type of track and you make a track and then you can change that track into anything. And also, you can change from, stereo to multi-channel and go back and forth between them, which has been really cool, particularly when you've got to deliver in 5.1. You can have a session running everything in stereo for the kind of the preliminary part of it and building it and client approvals, etc. And then you can scale that session to surround. Whereas in other DAWs, you've got to actually then create different types of tracks, like a 5.1 track. You can't just change a stereo track to 5.1 and back again. But that is one very powerful aspect of Reaper, that there is that flexibility. But it's that whole concept of thinking differently to the traditions of how to mix audio traditionally, where everything is kind of based off an analog workflow, a tape workflow essentially, and maybe taking those concepts into how you build sessions, and then that will affect you might be able to get better performance essentially out of those sessions if you start thinking outside the square. So
yeah. Look, that's pretty much been the norm with the DAWs from the inception. Once we started working with the audio side more predominantly, and what's interesting with what Justin is suggesting, where you put the reverb on individual tracks to spread the load on the cores. In the earlier days, and this is really interesting, in the early days when we were, I'm probably talking pre-Core 2, or it might have been Core 2, so we were not dealing with 12 or 14, 16 threads or 30 threads. We were only dealing with 2 cores. There was no hyper-threading, there was 2 cores. And I remember distinctly some Pro Tools clients were saying to me, Vin, this is ridiculous. I've run 3 or 4 plugins and all of a sudden this session is falling over at some particular latency. And I was saying to them, well, what are the plugins? And so they had maybe 14 tracks of audio and they were running 8 or 10 different reverbs per track, they were running the reverb on the individual tracks. And that's what was collapsing the session, because there just wasn't the CPU overhead. So in total opposition to what has been suggested now, I would say to them, well, how do you traditionally send to a reverb? You actually create a send, and then you send the tracks to the send. And that's what was the resolution for those issues back then when we had a smaller core count. And it's really interesting now that it's basically a complete role reversal. If you want to load balance across these multiple cores, it's better to run individual plugins, individual reverbs across it. So
should say it's not necessarily better, but it can be depending on what other plugins are in the chain. Because at a certain point, you have if there's too many things in sequence, then that adds up, and the latency of processing all those things in order adds up.
Yeah, of course. And look, you clip one core, you're going to get a dropout. I've seen it. Spiked core issues in other DAWs in the past. I mean, Sonar, again, I spoke about this in the first show, where Sonar had a predominantly spiked core. Even before you processed anything, there was, so if you had an 8-core machine, and depending on the audio buffer of the audio interface, you could have this very predominantly single spike core. Number 1 core was spiked, and all the others were pretty much dormant. But as soon as you started loading any type of plugins, and anything that landed on that first core would tip it over, then the engine would stop. So you could still have 80% of your processing left, but the engine would stop simply because that first spike core. There was something within the application itself that was landing on that, predominantly on that first core, that was causing the elevated processing. They did. I'm pretty sure they did resolve it. Oh, actually, no, I'm not sure whether they resolved it. But that was a very distinct thing that I kind of fell on, with how quickly a spiked core could stop an engine, despite the fact that you've still got 80% of your processing still available. And that's kind of relevant today as well, because if you do overload any of the individual tracks and you spike a core, it's going to cause an issue with the playback of the session. So you do have to, like Erin was saying, you have to think outside the box a little bit more and work out how you're going to assign your processing across the cores. But that's pretty much, we've been discussing that for a decade or so. But it is becoming more and more predominant, and more people are aware of it, which is good. Okay. Guys, that has been an awesome awesome conversation. But I think, we've kind of reached that point now where we can keep talking for hours, but I think we should sign it off now. And Justin is more than welcome to come back at any time if Justin is open to that. But I think now we should sign off. So, Erin, would you like to sign off?
Yeah, all right. See you, everyone. Thanks for having me on the show, Vin. It's been great, and great to chat with you too, Justin. And catch you guys soon.
Thanks for having me, guys. And maybe next time it can be winter here and summer for you, just to make it even. Yeah.
Oh, we'll do the opposite. We'll be in the shorts and the thongs and the singlets, and you can be all wrapped up in your beanie and your slippers. Okay, guys, that's it for this one. I'll definitely have both of you guys back on again, and see you guys on the next one.